Hey y'all, welcome back. Today we're checking out Americans Are Wrong about the War of Independence from Britain. Here's why.
America becoming independent was more like if you got dumped by a high-maintenance girlfriend who cost you too much money. Whereas Americans think that we truly are the ones that got away. Revolution, or rebellion. The original fight between Britain and America is a fascinating subject, not just in what actually happened, but in how it's depicted on both sides of the pond. In this video, we're debunking some of the myths that Americans believe about how the US came free from Britain, including why Britain cares way less than Americans think it does, and also why enlistees to the Revolutionary Army were required to have at least 2 good teeth.
I just learned from watching these British culture videos that while Americans call it the Revolutionary War, in Britain it's just called War for Independence. Just from the name alone gives you an idea of the perspective, you know.
To Americans, the American Revolutionary War, as we call it in the US, is legendary. It's a huge part of the history of our country, obviously. And to be honest, I'd argue that most of us are more likely to know facts and figures about this particular period in American history than we would about more world-changing wars. But across the pond, the American War for Independence, as it's most often called in the UK, is not much. It's a blip on the radar, possibly, perhaps briefly mentioned in a child's schooling experience in a long list of other revolutions from British colonies, but it's certainly not focused on. And to Americans who are raised, in many ways, to think that this huge, nation-altering moment in our country's history still plays in the minds of Brits today, who must be depressed every July 4th to think about the colonies they lost, we're a little bit surprised to learn that no one really cares. Or rather, Brits don't care at all, if they ever did. Surely someone did at some point in time, the British Crown, or the war wouldn't have happened, but the American memes that make it out to be that this is a sore spot in Britain's history are very mistaken. The reason is simple, really. The British Empire was vast, and American colonies were hardly the most important of them all. The Brits were far more concerned with other battles, and making sure they kept much more lucrative colonies like India around this time. America becoming independent was more like if you got dumped by a high-maintenance girlfriend who cost you too much money. Whereas Americans think that we truly are the ones that got away. And when it comes to teaching the American War of Independence in schools, well, again, it makes much more sense to be a bigger part of Americans' learning.
It's like being dumped by a high-maintenance girlfriend who cost you too much money anyway. So it's kind of like, okay, see you later. I'm gonna save a lot of money.
Because it's about us. It's on home soil. It's the founding of a nation. And it really starts much of our history as a country in terms of current governance. This helpfully means that we always get to it at the beginning of a school year when there's more time, as opposed to the end when you seem to run through 1900 to the 2000s in about 2 weeks. British history is so much longer, so much more filled with everything from queens and kings and medieval plots and an incredible amount of stuff. So much stuff. The American colonies are such a microscopic portion of this history, and so it doesn't make it into the British history standard schooling lessons. That's American misconception number 1.
Okay, so yeah, number 1, to Americans, it's our origin story. Or the origin story of our government. But to Britain, it's just like, it's just another war from another colony. We do this all the time. No big deal. There actually is a lot of American history, and even before the Spanish came. Or who was it? I guess Columbus. Italian, Spanish, collab. There's a lot of history before that, right? Aztecs, Incas, a lot of stuff happened. Okay, what's number 2?
Now let's talk about American misconception number 2, which has to do with the support that the revolution, or rebellion as it was referred to by the British Crown, had within the colonies. We are taught in America about all the exciting figures who led the charge and what we know in the US as the Patriot. These are your Benjamin Franklins, your Paul Revere riding through town to tell people that the British patrols were coming. And by the way, he never actually shouted, "The British are coming." This is a myth. He actually said, "The regulars are coming out," and he was not riding and yelling. He was quietly trying to warn people. Anyway, it's easy as Americans to—
The regulars are coming out. The regulars are coming out. Shh.
Anyway, it's easy as Americans to think that it was all of the colonists versus the British Crown, but that's not the case. About 20% of the population in the colonies were loyalists, which meant that they took the side of the British Crown back on home soil. This could be for so many reasons. People with close business connections with Britain, obviously, as well as people who were just conservative by nature when it came to valuing order, and they were concerned that an independent new nation would be chaos. Fast forward to 2024, and honestly, they were probably onto something.
The people that lived in Florida at the time were dealing with all kinds of stuff. They didn't care. They were fighting alligators and just trying to survive.
And actually, over the course of the war, there was a larger percentage of the population, estimated to be around 20 to 45%, who were in the middle. They were known as the trimmers, and they didn't fall completely on either side. This group often changed their loyalties based on who was winning at the time, which is honestly still how most of Orlando supports its sports teams to this day. Anyway, the Patriots, the side fighting for American independence, had to really try and coax men into serving in the army and provide them with incentives to do so. Take a look at this poster asking for colonists to join the Patriots in George Washington. They're promised a bounty of $12, a full supply of goods and clothing, a daily allowance, and more.
Let me just read that a little bit. Let me just take a closer look. To all brave, healthy, able-bodied, and well-disposed young men in this neighborhood who have any inclination to join the troops now raising under George Washington for the defense of the liberties and independence of the United States against the hostile designs of foreign enemies. Take notice. I can't read this. What is this? What does all that mean? Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday at the Shawswood Inn, Middlesex, Lieutenant with his something and recruiting party of, it's been scratched out, company in, can't read it, inch youth of spirit as may be willing to enter into this honorable service. The encouragement at this time to enlift is truly liberal and generous, namely a bounty of $12, an annual and fully sufficient supply of good and handsome clothing, a daily allowance of a large and ample ration of provisions, together with $60 a year in silver money on account of the whole of which the supplier may lay up for himself and friends as all articles proper for his. All right, that's the fine print. $12, $60 a year. Wow.
A full supply of goods and clothing, a daily allowance, and more. It says that you will return home with your pockets full of money and your head covered with laurels, i.e., meaning if you sign up with us, you are going to return having people think that you fought on the right side. The loyalists, or those on the side of the British Crown, also had to recruit, calling these people heroes and promising them 50 acres of land where you can retire when you finish fighting, as well as $5 and the clothing that you'll need.
Let's read that one too. Can't read that. 1st Battalion of Pennsylvania Loyalists, commanded by His Excellency Sir William Howe, KB. All intrepid, able-bodied heroes who are willing to serve His Majesty King George III in defense of their country, laws, and constitution against the arbitrary usurpations of a tyrannical Congress, have now not only an opportunity of manifesting their spirit by assisting in reducing to obedience their too long deluded countrymen, but also of acquiring the polite accomplishments of a soldier by serving only 2 years. This S and F thing is throwing me. I will say the Loyalist flyer is easier to read.
Also, fun fact, potential enlistees were required to have at least 2 good teeth. Not because they were going to be featured in any group photos, but because these teeth were needed to bite off the end of the paper cartridges used in the muskets. Now, another misconception also has to do with the support for the war on the British side, and by that I mean the people back home in Britain rather than in the colonies. Sure, there were plenty who supported the British Crown in the war against the colonies and making sure they tried to keep them obedient. Some very scathing posters were were created, including this one by J. Barrow, of the American rattlesnake, presenting the Americans as dangerous traders who were cunning and deceitful, like a rattlesnake. But there were also plenty in Britain who were concerned about the economic disadvantages of going to war with the colonies, and they wrote to the king urging him to basically give the American colonists the freedom that they wanted. They didn't want to risk this trading relationship. Their hope was that the Americans would stay friendly if the British pulled back and were less hostile, giving in to their demands.
Just give us some representatives in Parliament, right? That's all we wanted, really. And lower taxes.
And again, many were absolutely on the side of the aristocracy in Britain, referring to American independence as shocking and unpleasant and most unhappy business. But others, like Thomas Townshend, wrote to the Duke of Portland in 1776, saying that the government and majority have drawn us into a war that in our opinions is unjust in its principle and ruinous in its consequences. As he points out, the majority back home in Britain were very much not on the side of the Americans, but the point really is that there were more voices and differing opinions on both sides of the equation than is perhaps depicted in a simplified version of what happened.
Yeah, history's complicated.
Sides of the equation then is perhaps depicted in a simplified version of what happened. Some British printmakers, for example, did sympathize with the American cause, and they would depict Americans as an Indian maiden rather than the rattlesnake, which was a much more generous representation. The next misconception has to do with the reasons that America ever tried to declare independence in the first place. Many are familiar with the no taxation without representation line, but at a guess, most people would point to the Boston Tea Party, originally known as the destruction of the tea in 1773, as the main event that spurred on the rebellion or revolution. Colonists were mad about taxes on tea, specifically that the Tea Act allowed the East India Company to sell tea from China and American colonies without paying taxes. And so they destroyed an entire shipment of tea in protest. However, the American Revolution didn't fully start until the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775. This was a full 2 years later, and before the Boston Tea Party, if we back up a bit, there were other tax revolts against British royal authority and plenty of rumblings within the colonies of what they felt were unjust. This included the lesser-known Pine Tree Riot in 1772, where colonists protested heavy fines against them for harvesting trees. So essentially it was a tree party rather than a tea party.
I'm sorry. I've not heard of that. The Pine Tree what? Pine Tree Riot. The Pine Tree Riot was an act of resistance to British royal authority undertaken by American colonists in Weir, New Hampshire on April 14, 1772, placing it among 1722 under the Broad Arrow policy. It became illegal to cut down white pine trees larger than 12 inches in diameter in New Hampshire in order to reserve them for use as Royal Navy masts. This law was not strictly enforced until 1766, when Governor John Wentworth began enforcing it. In 1772, Sheriff Benjamin Whiting and Deputy John Quigley discovered a sawmill in Weir, New Hampshire, violating this law. They arrested the leader, Ebenezer Mudgett, and released him on bail. The next day, Mudgett and 20 men attacked the sheriff and deputy at the Quimby Inn, beating them nearly to death with large rods and sending them out of town on horseback. This incident is credited with inspiring the Boston Tea Party, which significantly contributed to the start of the American Revolutionary War. So the British wanted those trees for the Navy to build ships. The Pine Tree Riot was a test of British royal authority, which is partially evident by the light fines exacted against the rioters. By demonstrating that British rule was defiable, it is believed the riot helped to inspire the Boston Tea Party. Oh, we have all the participants here. Wow, I've never heard of that. That's kind of amazing.
And the final misconception, and the one that does take even me by surprise based on what they teach in American public school, is that the American Revolution did not end in 1776. Which is very confusing because you're like, we celebrate the 4th of July in America because it was July 4th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And this is what most Americans call Independence Day, which must mean this is when they separated from Britain, right? Genuinely, this is what most Americans think. We declared it, and so it must be so. But that's wrong. The American Revolution didn't end until 1783 when the Treaty of Paris was signed. In fact, France didn't even enter the American Revolution on the side of the colonists until 1778. And the final land battle wasn't until 1781 in Yorktown. This was years after the Declaration had been signed. But in some ways it does make sense why 1776 is the year Americans consider themselves to have gained independence when you look at it like one internet poster put it. Do you consider the end of your relationship to be when you broke up with your ex, or when they stopped calling you? But I suppose the main purpose of this video was to be the one you can send to your American friends when they ask you if Brits care about the American War of Independence or whether you cry into your cornflakes every July 4th. As the answer, after 10 years of living in the UK as an American, is definitely they do not. I did know a Brit who once told me they convinced an American that the UK actually skips July 4th on the calendar altogether because it's too sore a subject, which seems far-fetched that somebody would believe that, but sadly is probably true. Now that takes us to the end of this video. I hope you learned something new. As always, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Be sure to go to Girl Gone London and like and subscribe. Yeah, I learned some stuff. I did know that British people are kind of like, whatever, we don't really care. And I did know that India, with those spices in that tea, is more valuable to Britain than America was. I did know there's some lies about Paul Revere, and that it wasn't quite the way we've all been taught that it happened. You sort of forget about how complicated it is with people choosing sides. It's not all black and white. And you forget that there are some Brits that were trying to persuade the crown to give in to the American demands, right? I've always heard it's about taxation without representation, for sure. But I had not heard of the Pine Tree Riot. At least I don't think so. If I did, I forgot about it. Crazy. Crazy. I just reacted to a video about the Americanization of Britain, and it's kind of depressing. Because I feel like we've exported a lot of the most horrible things about American culture, like fast food and performative politics, media stuff, and I'm sorry about that. But overall, I feel like we're pretty similar, We're all human beings. We're just trying to survive, right? Feed our kids. I'd like to thank my patrons on Patreon. I'd like to thank my Buy Me a Coffee folks. Thank y'all for watching this with me, and I'll see you next time. Later.